Picture this. You're standing in the opulent throne room of Alexandria in 30 BC, marble columns stretching toward golden ceilings, the air thick with incense and terror. The most powerful woman in the ancient world reclines on her jewel-encrusted throne, her kohl-rimmed eyes cold as winter stones. A trembling slave girl, barely 16, approaches with a golden chalice of wine. But the wine isn't cold enough for Cleopatra's refined palate. Without blinking, without even pausing her conversation with visiting Roman dignitaries, she casually orders the girl to drink poison. Right here, right now, in front of everyone. The slave's hands shake violently as she lifts the deadly chalice, knowing that refusing means her mother, father, and baby brother will be tortured to death in the palace dungeons. This isn't Hollywood fiction or dramatic exaggeration. This is the documented, horrifying reality of how Cleopatra VII treated the thousands of human beings she owned like disposable objects, creatures existing solely for her twisted amusement. If you think you know the real Cleopatra, prepare to have your mind completely shattered, your worldview demolished, and your faith in humanity tested to its absolute breaking point. What I'm about to reveal will make you question everything you learned in history class, everything Hollywood has ever shown you, and everything you thought you knew about one of history's most famous women. Hit that like button right now if you're ready to discover the horrifying, soul-crushing truth they never taught you in school. The truth that historians have been desperately trying to sanitize for centuries. And drop a comment telling me, what's the most shocking, most disturbing thing you've ever learned about a historical figure that completely changed how you see the past? Because trust me, after today's video, Cleopatra is going to join that list in the most horrifying way possible. Everyone knows Cleopatra as the seductive queen who captivated Julius Caesar and Mark Antony with her legendary beauty and intelligence, but behind the golden facade of her seemingly glamorous reign lay a brutal system of human exploitation that would make modern dictators weep with envy. Cleopatra VII ruled Egypt from 51 to 30 BC, controlling a vast empire that stretched across North Africa and deep into the Mediterranean, commanding resources that dwarfed entire modern nations. But here's what historians conveniently gloss over in their romanticized accounts. Her incredible wealth, her legendary luxury, her political power, all of it was built on the broken backs and spilled blood of hundreds of thousands of slaves who lived in conditions so unimaginably horrific that death was often seen as a merciful release from their earthly torment. Ancient Alexandria wasn't just a prestigious center of learning and sophisticated culture. It was simultaneously a massive, bustling slave market where human beings were bought, sold, traded, and discarded like cattle at a livestock auction. Cleopatra personally owned more slaves than entire modern cities have populations. Conservative historical estimates suggest her household alone contained over 50,000 enslaved human beings, and the way she systematically treated them reveals a side of ancient royalty that will absolutely shatter your soul and leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the glories of gauche. Of classical civilization. Let me paint you a picture of daily life in Cleopatra's palace that will give you nightmares for weeks, haunt your dreams for months, and fundamentally change how you view ancient history forever. According to Plutarch, Cassius Dio Strabo, and other respected ancient historians whose painstakingly detailed accounts have somehow survived the centuries of book burnings and historical revisionism, Cleopatra's absolutely massive household slave population, we're talking about numbers that rival modern cities, were divided into rigid, merciless hierarchies of suffering, each level more brutal, more dehumanizing, more psychologically devastating than the last. At the very bottom of this hellish pyramid of human misery were what palace records coldly referred to as the expendable ones. Tens of thousands of men, women, and innocent children, some as young as 6 or 7 years old, who performed the most dangerous, degrading, and invariably life-threatening tasks imaginable. These unfortunate souls, torn from their families and thrust into a world of unimaginable horror, were systematically forced to test every single substance that might potentially enter Cleopatra's body. Her elaborate meals prepared by teams of terrified chefs, her rare wines imported from across the Mediterranean, her exotic cosmetics made from crushed pearls and gold dust, her intoxicating perfumes distilled from flowers that bloomed only in distant kingdoms, even her life-saving medicines concocted by court physicians who lived in constant fear of accidentally poisoning their queen. Can you even begin to imagine the bone-deep, soul-crushing psychological torture of being ordered to taste every single dish, every single sip, every single drop before the queen consumed it, never knowing with absolute certainty if today would be the day that someone somewhere in the vast network of Cleopatra's enemies had managed to slip poison into her food supply? Ancient sources describe in vivid, haunting detail how these human guinea pigs would literally shake with uncontrollable terror during meal preparation, times their entire bodies trembling like leaves in a hurricane. Their hands barely able to hold the golden spoons and jeweled chalices, their lives hanging by the gossamer thread of Cleopatra's increasingly paranoid, increasingly unpredictable, increasingly homicidal whims. But the food tasters, believe it or not, had drawn the golden ticket compared to the construction slaves who built Cleopatra's ego-driven monuments to her own supposed divinity. The queen's obsessive, all-consuming fixation with grandiose building projects, massive temples, impossible pyramids, floating palaces that defied engineering logic, consumed human lives like an insatiable furnace consuming kindling. Historical records, archaeological evidence, and surviving papyrus documents painted with the blood of the innocent strongly suggest that building just one of her massive ceremonial barges, floating palaces of unimaginable luxury that were essentially death traps wrapped in gold leaf, precious silks, and the dreams of a madwoman, required the deliberate, calculated sacrifice of over 300 human beings who toiled day and night in her nightmarish shipyards under conditions that would make modern sweatshops look like luxury resorts. These weren't unfortunate accidents or inevitable casualties of dangerous construction work. They were cold, calculated, deliberate sacrifices to meet impossible deadlines that existed solely to feed Cleopatra's bottomless vanity and her desperate need to prove her superiority over every other ruler who had ever lived. Workers who collapsed from exhaustion were left to die where they fell. Those who made mistakes were immediately executed. Anyone who showed signs of illness was thrown into the Nile to prevent contamination of the healthy workforce. The queen demanded absolute flawless perfection in everything that surrounded her, every detail of her environment, every aspect of her daily life, and imperfection of any kind, no matter how minor, how understandable, how human, meant immediate, brutal, agonizingly slow death. Ancient accounts describe in stomach-churning, nightmare-inducing detail how she would casually order slaves beaten to death with iron rods embedded with sharp metal fragments for infractions so minor they barely qualify as mistakes, accidentally dropping a cup during a feast, speaking 1 decibel too loudly in her divine presence, sneezing during a religious ceremony, even looking directly at her without explicit permission, which she considered an act of unforgivable blasphemy. But here's where this story transforms from merely horrifying into something that will fundamentally destroy your faith in human nature. She didn't just kill the offending slave and move on with her day like a normal tyrant. Oh no, that would have been too simple, too merciful for someone with Cleopatra's creative genius for inflicting maximum suffering. Instead, she pioneered and perfected a system of collective punishment so ruthlessly efficient, so psychologically devastating, that it would make the most notorious totalitarian dictators throughout human history weep with admiration and take detailed notes for their own regimes of terror. Here's the part that will absolutely destroy your faith in humanity, leave you staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning, questioning everything you thought you knew about human nature, and make you wonder how our species has managed to convince itself that we're somehow morally superior to wild animals. When Cleopatra suspected even the slightest hint of disloyalty among her vast slave population, and her paranoia meant that literally anything could be interpreted as disloyalty. A sideways glance, a moment's hesitation in following orders, even appearing too happy or too sad at the wrong moment. She didn't just punish the accused individual like a normal tyrant might. No, that would have been far too simple, far too merciful for someone with Cleopatra's sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare and mass terror. Instead, she implemented what historians have dubbed the decimation protocol, though that term doesn't even begin to capture the systematic, calculated, almost scientific precision of her cruelty. This was a system so ruthlessly efficient, so psychologically devastating, so perfectly designed to break the human spirit that it would make the most notorious mass murderers in human history bow down in horrified respect and beg for lessons in advanced torture techniques. For every single suspected traitor or supposedly disloyal slave, and remember, the definition of disloyalty could be as arbitrary as failing to smile enthusiastically enough during one of her speeches, 9 completely innocent slaves from the same household, the same work group, sometimes even the same biological family, would be selected through an elaborate lottery system that turned survival itself into a game of pure, random chance. But these weren't quick, merciful executions designed to send a simple message about obedience. These were elaborate, drawn-out spectacles of unimaginable agony, carefully choreographed theater productions, where human suffering was transformed into high art designed not just to kill the victims, but to terrorize the survivors into a state of absolute mindless obedience that transcended mere fear and entered the realm of complete psychological breakdown. The ancient sources describe these mass executions in detail, so vivid, so nauseating, so fundamentally disturbing that modern historians have spent centuries trying to find ways to sanitize them for public consumption. Slaves were forced to watch helplessly as their friends, their spouses, their parents, their innocent children, some barely old enough to walk, others who had served faithfully for decades, were crucified on wooden crosses that lined the palace gardens like a forest of human agony, burned alive in specially designed bronze bulls that amplified their screams and prolonged their suffering for the queen's acoustic pleasure, or torn apart limb by wild animals, lions imported from Nubia, leopards from the southern kingdoms, hyenas trained specifically for maximum brutality. In Cleopatra's private arena, while she watched from her ivory throne, taking notes on which methods produced the most entertaining deaths, the queen herself would often observe these hellish spectacles while casually dining on delicacies prepared by the trembling hands of terrified survivors, treating unimaginable human suffering as dinner entertainment, sipping rare wines from golden goblets while people died in agony just meters away from her banquet table. Ancient accounts describe how she would provide running commentary during executions, critiquing the victims' screams like a music critic reviewing an opera, rating their death throes for artistic merit, even offering suggestions to her executioners on how to make the killing more creative, more entertaining, more worthy of her refined tastes. But wait, steel yourself, because this story descends into depths of evil that will make you question whether human civilization has made any moral progress whatsoever. Cleopatra didn't just kill slaves for punishment or entertainment. She systematically murdered them for what she called scientific experimentation, but what any rational person would immediately recognize as sadistic torture disguised as intellectual curiosity, dressed up in the pretense of advancing human knowledge. Historical documents, papyrus fragments discovered by archaeologists in the ruins of Alexandria, and testimony from Roman witnesses reveal that she routinely used condemned slaves as test subjects for an extensive, carefully catalogued collection of poisons, deadly toxins, and experimental execution methods. She personally forced slaves to drink various lethal concoctions, mercury mixed with wine, arsenic dissolved in honey, deadly nightshade ground into their daily bread, exotic venoms milked from snakes and scorpions captured specifically for her research, while teams of scribes meticulously recorded every detail of their suffering, their symptoms, their final words, their death throes, the exact time it took for each poison to kill, which toxins caused the most pain, which ones were most efficient for assassination purposes. This wasn't medical research or genuine scientific inquiry aimed at advancing human knowledge. This was pure, undiluted sadism dressed up in the intellectual pretense of royal prerogative and scholarly advancement, the systematic torture of innocent people transformed into a pseudo-academic pursuit that would make modern war criminals weep with envy. The most bone-chilling, soul-destroying account comes directly from the respected historian Cassius Dio, whose detailed chronicles provide a window into evil so profound that it challenges our basic assumptions about human nature. He describes in nauseating detail how Cleopatra would regularly host elaborate dinner parties, where the primary entertainment, the main course of the evening's festivities, consisted of watching slaves die slowly, agonizingly, from experimental poisons, while wealthy guests, Rome's elite Egypt's nobility visiting dignitaries from across the Mediterranean, placed casual bets on how long each victim would survive, turning human agony into a sophisticated gambling game for the amusement of the ancient world's most powerful people. Picture this scene if you can bear it. Alexandria's most luxurious banquet hall, tables groaning under the weight of exotic delicacies and rare wines, the cream of ancient society dressed in their finest silks and jewels, all gathered to watch fellow human beings die in carefully controlled agony, while the Queen of Egypt kept detailed notes on which particular poisons produced the most interesting, most educational, most artistically satisfying deaths for her personal collection of torture methods. Guests would applaud particularly creative death throes, toast especially innovative execution techniques, and request encores of their favorite killing methods like audiences at a theatrical performance. As Cleopatra's paranoia and megalomania grew exponentially during her final increasingly desperate years, especially as the relentless pressure of Roman military might mounted like storm clouds on the horizon, and her political enemies circled like vultures, sensing the approaching death of their prey. Her treatment of slaves became even more psychotically brutal, more creatively sadistic, more systematically designed to inflict maximum psychological and physical torture on human beings who had already endured years of unimaginable suffering under her reign of terror. She began implementing what she euphemistically called loyalty tests, elaborate ritualistic torture sessions disguised as sacred royal ceremonies that would have made medieval inquisitors physically sick with disgust and forced them to reconsider their life choices. These weren't simple interrogations or basic punishment rituals. These were sophisticated psychological warfare operations designed to break the human spirit so completely that death became a welcome release from the horror of continued existence. Slaves were forced to prove their unwavering devotion to their increasingly unhinged queen by enduring horrific ordeals that pushed the absolute boundaries of human endurance, sanity, and the will to live. Some were buried alive in specially constructed underground chambers, elaborate tombs designed with just enough air to prolong their suffocation, and left to die slowly, inch by agonizing inch, while Cleopatra and her court stood above ground, like spectators at a sporting event, timing their survival with ornate water clocks, placing increasingly elaborate bets on how long each victim could cling to life in their earthen tomb before finally surrendering to the merciful embrace of death. Others were given impossible tasks specifically designed to guarantee failure and justify even more creative executions, like counting every single grain of sand in enormous hourglasses while being continuously whipped with leather straps embedded with sharp metal fragments and broken glass, where failure meant immediate brutal death and success meant facing an even more impossible, more torturous task. The following day creating an endless cycle of escalating suffering that could only end in death but never in victory or freedom. The historical records describe something that will make your blood run cold and your soul weep for humanity. Weekly events that Cleopatra called the Queen's Games, elaborate spectacles of human suffering, where slaves were forced to fight to the death for her personal amusement and the entertainment of visiting dignitaries, foreign ambassadors, and wealthy merchants who came to Alexandria expecting to witness the glorious culture of ancient Egypt. But these weren't gladiatorial combats between trained warriors equipped with proper weapons and protective armor. These were desperate, starving human beings, often children barely old enough to hold weapons, sometimes elderly slaves who had served faithfully for decades, forced to kill each other with farming tools, kitchen knives, sharpened sticks, and whatever makeshift weapons they could grab, while the most powerful woman in the ancient world laughed, applauded, and critiqued their technique like a theater critic reviewing a particularly engaging dramatic performance. The accounts describe scenes so disturbing that modern readers struggle to process them as historical fact rather than horror fiction. Cleopatra would provide running commentary during these death matches, offering cheerful advice to the combatants on how to kill more efficiently, more creatively, more entertainingly for her refined tastes. She would reward slaves who showed particular creativity in murder, perhaps by using psychological torture before the killing blow, or by finding especially innovative ways to inflict maximum pain, with slightly better food rations or an extra day of life before their own inevitable execution, creating a system where survival required not just violence, but artistic brutality that transformed victims into monsters. The psychological torture of being forced to murder your friends, your family members, your fellow sufferers just to survive one more day in hell created a level of trauma that modern psychology can barely comprehend, let alone treat. Survivors of these games, according to Roman witnesses who later testified about what they had seen, often went completely insane within days, either taking their own lives or retreating into catatonic states where they no longer responded to external stimuli, their minds having simply shut down, rather than process the horror of what they had been forced to do. Perhaps most disturbing of all, as her reign entered its final apocalyptic phase and she sensed the walls of reality closing in around her crumbling empire, Cleopatra began systematically using slave executions as sophisticated diplomatic tools, calculated demonstrations of her absolute power, designed to intimidate foreign visitors and potential enemies, while simultaneously serving as elaborate entertainment for her increasingly deranged court. When ambassadors from Rome, representatives from other kingdoms, or visiting merchants arrived in Alexandria, expecting to conduct normal diplomatic or commercial business, she would stage elaborate theatrical killing ceremonies, specifically designed to showcase her complete control over life and death, her absolute authority over every human being within her reach. These diplomatic murder shows would last for hours, sometimes entire days, with hundreds of slaves being systematically executed in increasingly creative, increasingly horrifying ways: crucifixion, burning, drowning, being fed to wild animals, being slowly flayed alive, or being forced to drink various poisons, all while Cleopatra calmly discussed trade agreements, military alliances, and political treaties as if nothing unusual was happening, as if the screaming and dying were merely background music to normal diplomatic proceedings. Foreign dignitaries would sit in stunned, horrified silence, trying to maintain their composure and complete their official business, while watching human beings die in unimaginable ways, struggling to negotiate with a woman who clearly viewed human life as nothing more than a negotiating tool, a theatrical prop in her increasingly elaborate political performances. Many visitors left Alexandria immediately after these experiences, some reportedly never recovering from the psychological trauma of witnessing such calculated evil, disguised as royal hospitality. As Octavian's relentless Roman legions closed in on Alexandria like an unstoppable tide of vengeance, and Cleopatra finally realized that her golden reign was crumbling into dust and ashes, that her legendary power was slipping through her jeweled fingers like sand, her final act of cruelty toward the thousands of human beings she had tortured and terrorized for decades was perhaps the most monstrous, most unforgivably evil deed in her entire catalogue of atrocities. Rather than granting freedom to her slaves, rather than allowing them to escape and build new lives away from her nightmare palace, rather than showing even a microscopic shred of mercy in her final hours, she coldly, calculatingly ordered the systematic mass execution of her entire household staff. Over 2,000 innocent human beings who had served her faithfully, who had endured years of abuse and torture, who had somehow survived the daily horror of life under her rule. The historical accounts of those final, apocalyptic days are so absolutely heartbreaking, so fundamentally tragic, that they will leave you weeping for humanity itself. Slaves who had served her faithfully for decades, who had watched their friends die, who had somehow endured the unendurable, were brutally murdered alongside their children, their grandchildren, their elderly parents. Entire family lines wiped out in a matter of hours, simply because Cleopatra couldn't bear the thought of anyone alive who might reveal her secrets to the conquering Romans. Ancient sources paint a picture of absolute hell on earth during those final days. The palace corridors, once gleaming with marble and gold, ran red with rivers of innocent blood as Cleopatra's guards systematically slaughtered everyone who had ever served her personally, everyone who had witnessed her crimes, everyone who knew the truth about the monster behind the golden mask. The screaming, according to witnesses who survived, could be heard throughout the city of Alexandria, a symphony of human agony that lasted for 3 straight days and nights. But here's the final unbelievable twist that will leave you absolutely speechless and questioning everything you thought you knew about human evil, even as she prepared for her own suicide. Even as she faced the end of her reign and her life, Cleopatra forced her few remaining slaves to test different methods of death to help her choose the least painful, most dignified option for her own demise. The famous asp, the legendary snake that supposedly delivered her final bite, that romantic symbol of her dramatic death that poets and playwrights have celebrated for centuries. It had already been tested on dozens of condemned slaves, while Cleopatra watched with clinical interest and took detailed notes on their suffering, timing their deaths, studying their final moments to ensure her own suicide would be as painless and theatrical as possible. When Octavian's soldiers finally breached the palace walls and entered Cleopatra's inner sanctum, they discovered not just the queen's lifeless body arranged in its carefully staged pose, but the fresh corpses of thousands upon thousands of innocent people who had been murdered simply because they had the cosmic misfortune of serving the last pharaoh of Egypt, the final monster of the Ptolemaic dynasty. This is the real Cleopatra, not the romanticized, glamorized seductress of Hollywood movies and Broadway musicals, not the noble, tragic queen of popular imagination and historical romance novels, not the brilliant political strategist that historians love to celebrate, but a genuinely psychopathic tyrant whose systematic, calculated, almost scientific cruelty toward enslaved human beings rivals and often surpasses the atrocities committed by history's most notorious monsters, whose crimes against humanity deserve to be remembered, studied, and condemned with the same intensity we reserve for modern genocidal dictators and war criminals. Her methodical treatment of slaves reveals a level of casual, everyday brutality, a complete absence of empathy or basic human decency, a fundamental inability to recognize the humanity of other people that puts her squarely in the same moral category as the worst mass murderers humanity has ever produced. This was not the passionate violence of a warrior or the desperate cruelty of someone fighting for survival. This was cold, calculated, systematic torture, implemented for entertainment, for scientific curiosity, for the simple pleasure of watching other human beings suffer and die. The next time someone talks romantically about the glory and grandeur of ancient civilizations, the next time you hear people waxing poetic about classical antiquity and the sophisticated culture of places like Alexandria, the next time educators present ancient Egypt as a pinnacle of human achievement, remember that this supposed glory, this celebrated grandeur, this vaunted sophistication was built entirely on the systematic dehumanization, torture, and mass murder of countless innocent people whose names we'll never know, whose stories were deliberately erased from official history, whose suffering was treated as nothing more than the necessary fuel for maintaining the lifestyle of sociopathic rulers who viewed human beings as disposable objects existing solely for their entertainment and convenience. Cleopatra's true legacy isn't just about political intrigue, romantic relationships with powerful Roman leaders, or the rise and fall of ancient dynasties. It's fundamentally about the hundreds of thousands of slaves who died horrible, agonizing deaths to maintain her power, to feed her sadistic appetites, to satisfy her megalomaniacal need for control and domination over every aspect of human life within her reach. These weren't abstract numbers in a history book, statistical casualties of ancient warfare, or unfortunate victims of historical circumstance. They were real people with hopes, dreams, families, children, loves, fears, and lives that mattered just as much as any queen or emperor who ever lived. Every golden ornament in her palace was paid for with human blood. Every luxury she enjoyed was built on human suffering. Every moment of her celebrated reign was made possible by the systematic torture and murder of people who had committed no crime other than having the cosmic misfortune of being born into slavery in her empire of evil. What's your take on this absolutely devastating dark side of ancient history that historians, educators, and popular culture have spent centuries trying to sanitize, romanticize, and sweep under the rug? Do you think we have a moral obligation to remember historical figures like Cleopatra differently, more honestly, when we know the full, unvarnished extent of their crimes against humanity? Should we be teaching children about these historical monsters without acknowledging the systematic torture and mass murder that made their glorious reigns possible? Is it ethical to continue celebrating ancient civilizations when we know they were built on foundations of human suffering that would make modern war crimes tribunals work overtime for decades? How do we balance historical education with moral honesty? How do we teach about the past without either sanitizing it beyond recognition or traumatizing students with the full horror of human evil? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you want more shocking historical truths that will completely shatter your assumptions about the ancient world and force you to confront the uncomfortable reality of how human civilization was actually built, one corpse at a time, one broken life at a time, one act of systematic cruelty at a time.